Okay. Again, thank you all for being here with me today. So what I'm going to do is just kind of work my way top down. And I'll just mute everybody really quickly, or if you can mute yourself, that would save me 10 seconds. Just to make sure my recording comes out clear. So I'm just going to work my way top down. In the future, when we do more of these, if you want, you can come in here, you can grab these little smileys. And if you see a really important question, you can start to upvote questions like this, not like that. What I also started to do is just add some little pink Post-its in there, just for me to remember how I want to answer these. But then as they get answered, I'll move them off to the side here and I'll have the recorded clips. So just kind of going top down. Matthew asked, and Peter, I don't know if you're here. Let me see. Let me change there's Peter. Peter, I moved your question up here because I think I'll probably answer this one in line with this one. So Matthew asked, before the first workshop, what tools or techniques do you use to ensure that participants are onboarded and understand their importance in the overall outcome? Perfect question, especially a good place to start. Facilitation used to feel like magic to me when I'd see a meeting run really well. And I didn't realize most of it is just all the stuff that happens in the background and in between, and all sort of like the coordination and the communications and the one-on-ones and all that stuff. So this is a great place to start. The way that my best meetings and sprints and workshops happen when I spend a lot of time first one-on-one with each person in the room. That's a tall task if you're doing like a large format workshop. If you're doing it with 100 people, you probably can't do that, but you could probably find some leaders or some key influencers and decision makers, especially the folks that might have hired you. So I do try to spend some time one-on-one with folks. And this is where Peter's question ties into this. So, the questions that I ask depend on the workshop and the expectations. I'm getting a little bit of like feedback in here. So I'm just going to go in and mute. Okay. The questions vary. So like, for example, Peter asked about pre-sprint. So before something like a design sprint, which is about like ideation and prototyping, I would tend to ask them questions about what problems are they hoping to have solved? What have they done in that sense to make sure that that's an important problem, one that's worth solving? So I'll ask them about like research that they've done. I'll ask them to articulate what the customer problem is there. Most times that leads to more foundational questions, which is about like what they're hoping to get out of the session personally, why why now? Why is this a time to be doing this? What's happening in the company? What are they seeing inside and outside that now is the right time to be having this group of people work on this problem? And then I'll also ask them questions about like on the sort of the concern side of things. So what should we avoid talking about? What are your expectations? Where do you want to be by the end of this? That's a great barometer for me, because if they've hired me to run a 2-hour workshop and they're expecting to have a lot of things accomplished after a 2-hour session, that's a good place for me to say, where we'll probably be is here. So let's make sure that we're aligned so that when we get into it and at the end of it, there's not a total misalignment in terms of expectations. But yeah, I think I over-index on the challenges and concerns people have. That's where people will bring up, because it's one-on-one, they might bring up concerns about other team members, about senior leadership not allowing the ideas to sort of run through, and feeling like I'm going to join this, but I'm used to leadership coming in and killing our ideas. So that's a good indication for me to pay attention to. There's another question down below about engagement. So if that person is disengaged, there could be something that comes out in a one-on-one about doing these many times before, but their ideas never kind of like getting to market. So that's a great conversation and place to start with that person, because they'll tend to share a little bit more. So a healthy amount of one-on-ones. It's super time consuming. I used to just do like one with the person that hired me. Then I do one plus their right-hand person. And now I found myself just talking to every person, because the time invested, even for 30 minutes, it's like exponential return, because I get that person really like, I've developed a relationship with them and I know what's important to them. So that's like the individual stuff I do. And then when I start to bring them together, is in two formats. One, I'll jump down here, is a team kickoff, right? So now because I've done the one-on-ones, I know who's showing up and who's there. But in those one-on-ones, it's actually fairly common for me to rule one or two people out, or for us to agree together, this sounds interesting, but I'm over here, so it doesn't make sense for me to be a part of this. Even better, they might say like, you should talk to this person. So that's great intel for me, because again, question below about engagement. One of the biggest reasons that people disengage is because they shouldn't be there, but they're there because their boss or their boss's boss asked them to be there, or they don't want to be left out of the conversation, but they don't necessarily have the experience and the expertise to contribute to the conversation. So they feel shitty. They feel like they can't contribute and be a part of it. So they kind of check out. So in those one-on-ones, I learn a lot of the time about who should and should not be there. So that once I get them into a team environment and do a team kickoff, there's trust between myself and that person. And I'm much better able to pay attention to the cues that I might have picked up on in those one-on-ones. The other thing I do is around pre-work. So especially not so much now, but at the end of 2020, when Mural and Miro and Zoom and everything wasn't such a thing, I would use pre-work as a way to get people into the tools that I was trying to use. So I'd have my one-on-ones in Zoom, because maybe they had only been used to phone calls or Teams calls or something like that. So I'll try to have the conversation, the tools that I'm going to be using. I'll even show them how I'm capturing notes during our one-on-ones in Miro and Mural. So I'm getting them used to seeing how the conversation is going to be captured and unfold in the workshop. I also invite them into the Miro and Mural boards so that they can start to just get used to using stickies. So getting them used to the technology, but then I'll also, if I'm hired as the researcher or if I'm partnering with the research team, that's where I'll also start to create a bit of a dashboard of artifacts and research and discovery documents, things that have been already created and assembled, because that's, again, another place for people to check in to make sure that they should be in the workshop itself. So that's where I start to use the digital whiteboards as a place to capture and sort of like prime the conversation. Good question. I'm just going to kind of keep chugging along. Here's another one by Mathew. Do you allow your project sponsors, the hierarchical superiors of the participants, to participate in the workshops? Well, yes and no. So yes, let me start with no. No, if they're there just to eavesdrop or make sure their team member is saying the right things or doing the right things. It's really distracting. Even if you have like somebody with their camera turned off, but they're just kind of like listening in, that's a distraction point. So I try to minimize to only the people that are going to be coming and participating. But I do make some space for silent observers. So what I try to do is I try to make sure they join at opportune times. I announce that they're going to be coming and that they're going to be leaving, just so that people don't feel like, where did so-and-so go? But it's also, so on the latter side, I use that too, because sometimes, I'm not sure what kinds of facilitators we all are, but sometimes I get hired as like what my friend calls like a Trojan horse. So they're trying to bring design thinking in, or they're trying to rally the team to think differently or work differently. And they use me as like a model for what it could look like. And so I'll design with them times for their boss and their boss's boss to come in, to almost serve as like a real-time view into what we're doing and how it works and what it looks like. And that helps to really, it makes the process of spreading what happened in the workshop much more efficient, rather than like a PowerPoint and a meeting where you have to kind of like recap for the person. So just designing time for them to drop in has been pretty successful. Okay, we're sticking with the Mathew theme here. Next one. Any tips for handling unwilling or low motivation participants? Yeah, so this is where I was going before. So in those one-on-ones, I get to know, there's so many cues that you get along the way. So who waits to the last possible second to schedule a one-on-one with you, who cancels, who reschedules, right? So those are all the cues for me that this may not be the most important thing for this person, rightfully so. Maybe they got 10 other things on their sitting on their lap. So that's where I start to pay attention for people that are going to be, that are like super into it and motivated. And then having that conversation with them, again, I get to hear, how important is this to you? Why? What are you trying to get out of it? So one-on-ones are really important. So that's like beforehand. Then at the start, right, you can do some check-ins, nothing new there. I actually just had a conversation with my friend Emily Lavada. Actually, in the bottom down here, there's a link to this series that I do, Facilitators Q&A. The latest one that I haven't published yet, maybe in a week or so, is with Emily, and she reviews this check-in framework that she uses, which is super simple. She just asks people to check in. Is this really? Okay. Check in with either mentioning that they're snoozed, stretched, or stressed. I won't spoil it. I'll let Emily tell how she uses the framework, but really just like creating a quick space for people, for me to understand how everybody's showing up. And you can do that in a million different ways. There's this thing here. I'll put it in the chat. This is a fun one. So sometimes if I just need to like take the temperature of the room, once in a while, I'll go to this check-in prompt thing. I'll drop that in the chat as well. So sorry, Katerina. I never saw your chat. One sec. Okay, there's the board. Oh, Taylor, you're the best. Taylor dropped it right below. Okay. So I'll keep going. So yeah, check-in prompts just so I can read the temperature of the room, because maybe things change from when I had the conversation in the one-on-one. And then also I also do a lot of back channeling. So as much as it's a pain in the butt, I try to get into the teams that hire me. I try to get into their Slacks or Teams accounts, because that allows me for like much more real-time communication. For example, during 10, 15-minute breaks, it's difficult. Like, unless I set up a breakout room within the teams, which would be weird for everyone to come back and two of us are missing. I'm able to back channel somewhere else with a person, because then if I see them kind of like slumping, frowning, you can tell when people are reading versus paying attention in a workshop. There's also tools if you want to be really snoopy. I think it's called Class, is like a Zoom platform, a Zoom built platform, and you can tell when people's focus goes elsewhere. I don't use that because that would just distract me more than anything else. But I will do a bunch of back channeling just to check in with people. How are you doing? Looks like you're tired, right? And then even just asking the team. It looks like, I know this is important and we had an agenda set, but it looks like we're struggling. We're at the 3-hour mark. Does it make sense to keep going? So that requires a little bit of vulnerability on your part to not be so attached to your agenda and your outcomes. And then, Mathew, I had a follow-up question for you. So I'm just going to leave this here. If we get to it, cool. If not, if you want to add a little bit more context for me, because we could probably spend 2 hours on frustrated workshop people, and they come for all sorts of different reasons being frustrated. So I just, based on your example, I gave you like option A or option B, or maybe it's an option C I didn't think of. So you could just give me more context in a follow-up sticky. Luckily, we have another question by Mathew. You're the best today. What is your approach when the group cannot align on a critical decision? Well, for me, I try to make sure that I understand what the critical decisions are. And that's, again, the one-on-ones and sort of like the grounding work that I do to make sure I understand expectations. And then I take all of that I've heard from them and I put it back on a board and ask us all to agree. This is the topic we're talking about. These are some of the expectations. Here's some of the constraints I heard you mentioning, things that we should focus on versus things we shouldn't focus on. What else, right? And so like I asked them to set the sort of the altitude of the meeting or the workshop, because it's not my agenda. I'm designing it based on what they want to get out of it, right? So like the more I can put that back in front of them, and have them say, not this, but that, then we can all sort of align from the outset. But then where I see people struggle to make a decision is when they don't have the evidence to move forward with that. So for example, in framing, that in problem framing, it's all about discovery. So I'm working with a group of 4 or 5 people, right? And it's all very like internal expertise. But at some point we get into the customer domain. And while we might have researchers and experienced designers or just customer support people that are good proxies to them, there could be moments where we decide like, it feels like we're guessing. Like it feels like we should pause and go and talk to some customers, or you should go and talk with some customers and then gather that stuff up and come back. And so that's where I feel like groups can't make a decision if we've moved away from our agreed upon agenda and altitude that we agreed to talk about and expectations, or if we're still there, but just don't have the data or the evidence or the insights in order to make that informed decision. There's one related to this. Again, I'll just use framing as an example because it's actually a really difficult conversation to lead. I use this one framework called the Cynefin, and most people are like really struggle with it at first because it's a sense-making model to figure out the relative complexity of the space that we're trying to work within. And the reason that I do it is because the group that I'm working with, there tends to be other people that didn't join, whether they're too senior or too busy or just couldn't be a part of it, or maybe they're a customer and it didn't make sense to invite them in. But that framework helps us decide upon what's the level that we're expected to solve at right now. So you could be working on in this space of simple problems or more complicated or really complex problems. And that framework lets the group have the conversation together. And so like in the one-on-ones, when everyone was talking about, we're going for like big moonshot ideas, this is really important, we want totally new thinking, there's a new space for us. And then they see the sorts of problems that are complex and they don't have the research to support it. They can make that decision together to sort of like back up a little bit into a more simple space, because maybe they're just going to build like rapport and sort of muscle memory in the team of doing this like having these new conversations and new way of working. And so they all agree together that they're going to move into a more simple domain. It's also helpful too to think, what did senior leadership want us to, where did they want us to be in terms of complexity? So it's things like that and letting them have that conversation together out loud so that when they decide on the things that they want to decide upon, they first had a conversation to agree upon those things. That framework, by the way, people are always like, what is that thing? It's called the Cynefin framework. Dave Snowden. Okay, Leo, I see your question in here. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to add it. Oops. And I'll try to get to it. Okay, but I'm just working my way down here. Okay. How do you read the room in a remote setting? Which nonverbal cues do you look for most often? And what do those cues tell you? Yes, Taylor, good question. Okay, so the thing that happens most, the scenario that happens most is somebody's talking too much. And so what that looks like, the nonverbal cues are just this like, it's a mixture of like frustration and embarrassment. The embarrassment part might seem strange. So sometimes the team wants to do really well. So they're kind of like scoring themselves because it's important, right? And there's a lot of decisions to get made. And this one person is dragging the conversation down and talking and like going in loops. Sometimes people on the team will message me or grab me and say like, we need to move faster. We need to do things like this. we need to like move forward. And sometimes I listen to them, but sometimes it's really important for the group to almost say for themselves, like it feels like we're off track. So if they're not getting there, if they're just kind of languishing and they're letting this person talk, or if they're waiting for me to always, be the strict facilitator and cut that person off, sometimes I'll just ask a question, like it seems like we're losing some of the team. Like, have we gone down a rabbit hole? Are we still at the altitude that we said we would? And that invitation tends to be enough for somebody to speak up and be like, no, yeah, I think we should probably go back to be over here, because that's what we agreed was most important. So just check-ins like that tend to be enough. But yeah, it's strange because it's tough to read frustration, because if you're in your own head, which as a facilitator, I'm in my own head a ton, because you're not being the expert, you're just sort of like shaping things. So you might misread that as you're disappointing them. Most of the time, what I've learned is that they're disappointing themselves in some way, and you have to figure out a way to like go into the conversation enough to get them back to the agenda, back to what they agreed upon. When I can't figure out faces, because most of the time I'm working with strangers or people that I just met a week or two ago, the back channeling is a huge thing. So looks like you're tired, or looks like, how are you doing right now? I'm tired, but also so-and-so won't stop talking. Like, what do you think we should do? Right. And so like that back channeling is huge. I don't know if everyone has access to do that. If you're an internal facilitator, you probably do. If you're an external facilitator, something you should think about in advance, like how will I be able to talk with people individually during the session and sort of right after the session. Right after is probably easy, but during. So that's one that came to mind. Okay. I'm going to see if I can get through. I think this is the last two. So I'm going to see if I can do it. As a facilitator, how do you adjust your posture based on the group you are facilitating? Do you have a logic for this, or do you do it by gut feeling? Knowing the kind of person I am, Mathew, it's probably more gut feeling, although with more repetition and cycles, my intuition gets stronger and stronger about who needs what. So there's this one thing though. My nature is to be very chameleon-like. So I'm able, like, one part that makes me a good facilitator is I can easily adjust to like the personalities and temperature and sometimes bravado and ego of a room, right? So like I can get really strong in my posture if I know that we've got like some heavyweights in the workshop that are going to like throw their weight around. And then I can also adjust when it's at like a room full of delicate, quieter people. I actually am by nature much more quiet and introverted, but I can flex left and right. So I think the thing to keep in mind is, as a facilitator, as a human being, you want to be authentic. So you want to like always be true to who you are as a person. And that's still true as a facilitator. You're still a human being. But there's also this balance, because as a facilitator, you're more of service to the people that you're facilitating. So it's much less about you. That in the link below, you should watch the talk I had with, oh my gosh, Allison Coward. She talked about facilitating facilitators and how her greatest mark of doing a great job is when she's silent and the room is just sort of working on its own. She had a really interesting story about someone that called her out for being so quiet. So I don't know. I'm not sure how best to answer this, because of course it depends on the context and you getting to know who I am as my personality, but it depends, as long as you can maintain that sort of tension between being true to who you are as a person and being of service to the room. And then last question. I work with a young female facilitator who struggles to establish authority with new groups. Do you have advice for how to establish this rapport? Yeah. This question reminded me of something I just read in actually a marketing book, of the balancing empathy versus authority. So of course, it's not only about authority, right? That's like the difference between power and force. So for her, like the most important thing I would recommend for her is to establish relationships outside of the workshop, because once you get a group of people in the room, I'm forgetting his name. There's this social dynamic study, and I can't remember, but long story short, once you get a bunch of people in the room, they show up with different personalities and egos and go on power trips and whatnot. So the more that she can spend time with individuals and establish rapport and trust and build her confidence in smaller doses there, she'll probably have more support. And then she can build like a little bit of support. She'll probably have like at least 1 or 2 people that have her back in the workshop with like a larger group of people. So most important thing I do for her is to do more one-on-one with the folks. It's also not in my nature to talk really quickly and just blow through questions, because I feel like you feel like I'm rushing through your stuff, but I'm just trying to get through all the questions. So these were awesome. Thank you. Hopefully you can join a future one. I will, I remember to record. I forgot to record the last one. So in the next day or two, I'll have a recording of all this stuff up there, and come and ask more questions. Come to the problem framing and design sprint ones. And I hope to see you there. Thanks again to our sponsors, Mural. You all are great. Thanks, y'all.